there, BookTube, welcome back to my channel. I'm not in my usual place today, but I just wanted to stop in and make a quick video because I've just finished the first of my nonfiction readings and I want to share that experience with you. In a video last week, I think I told you about 5 nonfiction books that I'm planning to read very soon, and I've just finished the first one, and it is called A Little History of the United States by James West Davidson. This is a book that I didn't choose so much, it was kind of chosen for me. One of the students that I'm working with has been assigned this book in order to do some of his summer reading and essays. And while I'm helping him with his essay writing, I thought it would be a good idea for me to read the source text so we could have discussions about the topics that he's writing his essays about. My student is a middle schooler, and I think that this book is a little bit above his level because I found it very readable in the second part. But the first part was definitely a slog to get through. In the early recorded history of the United States, or the early recorded history of the Americas, because it wasn't the United States then, in Davidson's writing about the beginning of the recorded history of the Americas, in the period where we had the European explorers and the sailors from Asia, there were some holes in some of his theories, and I felt like some of what he was saying was a little prejudicial, and I was a little put off by the writing in the first 100 pages of the book. But after that, the pace really picked up and I felt very interested in what he had to say. So it was a challenge for me to encourage my students to read those first 100 pages because there were places that I felt like the writing wasn't going where it should have gone. But this is one of those books where the investment, the early investment, while it does feel like a drudge to get through it, does pay off in the end, because that kind of boring part of the book was over by the time we got to page 100. This is a 300-page book, so if the pace picks up around page 100, then you still have 200 pages of really interesting stuff to get into, so the investment is worth it. But for a 13-year-old student who is not excited to be reading during the summer vacation, I could understand why this was very hard for him, and so I was glad that I was able to read it and kind of motivate him through this process. But aside from working with my student, I found this book to be really interesting. There were definite holes in my own knowledge and appreciation of American history. I didn't grow up in this country, I grew up in the West Indies, and so I learned more European history than American history. And while I live here now and I want to know more about American history, there are things, there are little references that you hear sometimes that you don't always know the connection. Like, I know that there was a war between America and Vietnam sometime in the maybe 60s to 70s, but I didn't necessarily know the full extent of American involvement, how that came about, and why it was so important to American economy and the future of the Americas. So this was a great opportunity for me to read something that I might have put down if I was just reading it for myself, because like I said, the first 100 pages, they weren't that inviting. But afterwards, the more recent history, as I got into more familiar territory, the writing got better and my experience just grew exponentially. My main criticism of this book is that the author doesn't cite any sources other than saying where he got the words that he used to quote Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. He doesn't really talk about any other places where any of his other quotes have come from. And that for me is a huge issue. This book is not a self-published text. It was published by Yale University Books. And to have a book come through such a scholarly and intellectually focused publishing house gave me pause, because how can you have a book that has to cite other scholarly works and not mention the source of any of those works, and yet is trying to talk about the history that those works provided, try to give them credit on the pages but not credit the people who curated and collated and recorded those events. So I felt like that was a little bit ironic for a book about history to not say where the history came from. Like on the flyleaf, there's information that the illustrations are done by someone called Gordon Allen, and the maps were drawn by Bill Nelson. However, unless Bill Nelson lived in the 1500s and circumnavigated the Americas, he couldn't possibly have created this map without having some kind of a reference. And these maps appear throughout the book. how do you create a map of the Americas without some kind of a reference? The illustrators, I could understand, okay, the illustrations maybe are a product of someone's imagination, but a map showing the border states and the political and geographical boundaries that allowed the Civil War to be fought the way it was. I mean, I feel like you need a credit for this. But aside from this book failing to acknowledge intellectual property, I felt like the writing was very successful. At the beginning of chapter 34, I wanted to read you a few sentences that read like prose. The author says, "Out of the flames of war, an ashen world appeared, one hugely different from the pre-war world of 1939. To begin with, there were the ruins. City buildings caved in, rubble, broken glass, streets black at night because electric plants had been bombed. 12 million prisoners of war to be seen to. Food and money so scarce, people often traded goods, a bracelet for some bacon or an old coat for a chicken." I mean, that's really good writing, right? But you could tell that this author preferred this time period. His biases came through in this book. In fact, in the beginning of the book, that was one of my criticisms about his writing. I could see his biases. I could see where his prejudices lay. Like, I felt like the way he spoke about African Americans, and not just African Americans, but Africans in history, I felt like there were some prejudices there, and there were points in the beginning of the book where I was a little upset about some of the things that I read and felt like this author and maybe this book was going to do some kind of racial profiling or set up some unfair racial comparisons that I just didn't want to read. But like I said, I had to read the book, so I pressed on. But as I got through that time period, I realized that his prejudices aren't just against a people. It is just maybe, I don't know. Everyone has an agenda, everyone has a bias, and it's unfair to criticize someone for theirs when you have one of your own. But I could tell from reading this book, I could tell what some of the author's prejudices were. Like when the author spoke about how smallpox came to the Americas. He spoke about how Europeans had been exposed to smallpox for decades because the disease had been running rampant for a long time. And so many Europeans had built up an immunity to it. So when they carried the germ to the Americas, unwittingly so, they were immune, so they thought that they were okay. But people who had not been exposed to smallpox got sick. And he said the first person to have a breakout, the first person to have a visual breakout from the disease was an African. And then he kind of makes this link as though this African, as the first victim of smallpox, unwittingly gave it to these Americans and single-handedly created an epidemic that killed thousands, maybe millions of Indians or natives. And I felt like that was a bit of a stretch and an unfair one to make, to blame a victim for the effect of something that he also suffered. I didn't like that, and that happened early in the book, and so that had set up this idea in my mind that this author and this book were going to be prejudiced against certain peoples and time. But that was an unfair assumption to make. That was one of those isolated moments in the book that while it was a huge event for me, it really was just a blip on the 500-year span that the author covered here. His focus was on the people that characterized this history, not the events themselves. And so this is not a book that you could probably read and follow if you had no knowledge of American history. It would be very difficult to make some of those connections. And you couldn't use this book as a reference for a scholarly paper if you were writing, say, a college type essay, because like I said, there are no sources credited, and I don't know how much of this book is based on the author's own experience and how much is taken from other sources and what those other sources were. But this is the kind of book, if you have some exposure and you want to fill in some of those gaps in your knowledge, if you're preparing for a cocktail party with some politicians and some historians and you want to have some tidbits to use to make conversation, this is one of those books that will help you make connections in general, not just with people and conversations, but connections in terms of understanding some of the historical events that are still happening in our time, but that have roots in periods outside of our own experience as individuals. Like if you want to know the backstory of Osama bin Laden's army and why the United States created this army led by Osama bin Laden and then turned against him eventually. Like if you want to know the American involvement in Vietnam, why North and South Vietnam had this war and why America got involved in the first place. This is the book that answers some of those questions and gives interesting information about the people at the center of these events, and then links these events with other connecting surrounding events that were happening at some other time and happening with some other people, but that was kind of spawned with this person in this time. This was a fascinating book in the last part. At the end, I gave it 4 stars. I recommend this book for adults. I don't think this is a book that children are sophisticated enough in their reading to really appreciate some of the author's words and his language and his prose. So I wouldn't recommend this book for a 13-year-old student, but that's what we have. So my 13-year-old student and I will be reading it and discussing it, and through using this book as a source, he will learn some things about the American history that maybe he didn't know, and maybe from our conversations it will spark an interest for him to go look up more information. So I guess it does accomplish that if that's what you want. But for an adult reader, I think that this was a great foray into American history, especially for someone who is a little fuzzy on some of the details of American history. This was a great gap filler for some of those things, a little introduction to some of the American presidents and what are some of their contributions to American history. Not the entire full history of the Americas, but a little intro. And so this is indeed a little history of the United States. James West Davidson, the first of my 5 nonfiction reads for the summer. And so I just want to pop in and tell you about it. Let me know in the comments if you've read this one, if you enjoyed it, if you have another history book about an interesting time period that you like and want to recommend to me. Go ahead and leave that in the comments, or let me know what nonfiction book you're reading. And if you're not reading a nonfiction book, may I encourage you to pick one up. Sometimes you can find a nonfiction book that educates and entertains you at the same time, and this was definitely one of those. So thanks for watching this video. Leave me a comment down below. We'll talk down there, and until next time, happy reading. Bye.